Alright, we are going to introduce this week's speaker, who I've only just discovered has been at UQ for longer than anybody in this room, since 1999. And I'll leave you to explain why, but everybody knows Jeremy Simmonds, who's been with us in more guises than I realised, for more years than I realise now, but has just started a NatureNet Fellowship, which is co-funded between the Nest Hub and the Nature Conservancy, working in Northern Australia, which is your old stomping ground in your old life as a consultant before coming back, doing a PhD and then becoming an academic. So, thank you, Joe.
Thanks, Martine. Thank you.
Better explain that, sorry, I was baffled.
Well, yeah, I started coming to this campus in 1999. I wasn't some prodigiously talented child, like intellect. I played cricket at the University of Queensland Cricket Club as a teenager. But it is true, I've been coming and going from this place for a long time. But in the most recent stint, since 2013. Before that, this was like my bread and butter as a consultant. Now, this first part of the talk is going to be a little bit, hopefully not too dry, but it's going through the architecture and the mechanics of the EPBC Act as it applies to environmental approvals. So, yeah, so there's going to be a few sort of definitions and a bit of text to wade through. But basically, this is Australia's major central piece of environmental legislation. And the really key thing, and this will come up over and over again over the next half an hour or so, is this concept of matters of national environmental significance. So the Act is really all about the protection of these matters of national environmental significance. What are they? There's 9 of them. World Heritage Properties, so this is the wet tropics, North Queensland. National Heritage Places, this is a little bit of a random one. They can be natural, like the Glasshouse Mountains. The Sydney Opera House is on the National Heritage List, for example, as well. Threatened species, threatened ecological communities, migratory species that Australia has international commitments to conserve, the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park, wetlands of international importance, the Ramsar Convention, the Commonwealth Marine Environment, so 3 to 200 nautical miles off the coast of Australia is a matter of national environmental significance. Any nuclear actions are captured by this, including uranium mining. Water resources that might be affected by major coal projects or coal seam gas development, and that's the newest, I guess, trigger on the MNS list. There's 2 kind of major regimes under this Act. The first is biodiversity conservation, so it's an apparatus for the listing of species and ecological communities, for example. The second theme or regime is this environmental assessment and approvals, and that's the focus of this talk today. Okay, so this is like a simplified framework or decision pathway for the Act, and we're going to step through this over the next few minutes. Okay, so the first question, right at the start, if you're proposing to undertake a project, a development, infrastructure, will the proposed action have a significant impact on any matters of national environmental significance? Under this Act, there's a requirement for approval from the Commonwealth Environment Minister if that action has, will have, or is likely to have a significant impact on any MNES. We know what the MNES are, but what's the significant impact? I bet you're all dying to know. And here it is, just to totally clarify things, an impact which is important, notable, or of consequence having regard to its context or intensity. So that's obviously extremely clear and explicit and allows for a very streamlined impact assessment process. Fortunately, there's a lot of guidance. So this document, Matters of National Environmental Significant Impact Guidelines, is kind of like almost the Bible, certainly in the consulting world as it applies to impact assessment. So this outlines criteria for assessing the significance of an impact. Really important document, and I guess if people are interested in learning more about the Act, I really encourage you to get familiar with this document in particular. Okay, so here's the question, the key question. If it's just dead set obvious that the action is not going to affect any of those things we saw in that early slide, you know, like a car park being built in the middle of the CBD, then there is no need for Commonwealth oversight. It's clearly not going to affect any matters of national environmental significance. So this all becomes a little bit irrelevant if it's just fair income not going to have an impact. But if there's any possibility that a project or an action will have an impact on any of those matters, then you are compelled, required by the law, to submit to the Commonwealth what's called a referral. And a referral is like an initial screening process where you consolidate a whole lot of information about the project in a standardised template that gets submitted to the government, and they make a decision on how the project and the approvals process should proceed from there. The key kind of message that comes out of that referral, and it's a self-assessment, so it's prepared by the proponent, typically by consultants on their behalf. They put forward a determination of whether they believe the project will have a significant impact. So one would undergo all sorts of analyses and assessments, provide that referral to the government and say either we think this is a significant impact or we don't think it is. The government obviously then makes that decision. So it's an online form. Just getting into the real nitty-gritty of it quickly, it's an online form with a standardised set of subheadings, sections that one needs to fill out with information requirements, summarising the action, what matters may be affected, the context, how those impacts that you identify will be managed, a bunch of other sort of administrative stuff. But as I said, the key thing is this conclusion that you input into the referral, given all the information you consolidate, is the project likely to have a significant impact? In the last few years, there's now a fee to submit an EPBC referral to the government. It's about $6,500 to submit one. But there are exemptions for small businesses, I believe. Okay, so in the referral, there's a whole lot of information you need to provide. First and foremost, what are the matters of national environmental significance that will be potentially affected? The government has this database, an online tool, that allows you to get an idea of what matters you need to consider in your referral. This is here, St. Lucia, 1 kilometre buffer. And so it gives you a report, and it's a reasonably detailed report, but just for where we are now, 55 threatened species are potentially of relevance to this location. So it's reasonably coarse and conservative based on spatial proximity criteria and some sort of pretty high level habitat mapping or distribution mapping, I guess. This is just an example of where you'd start. So now you've got an idea of what matters are relevant, and then you get into the baseline description and the assessment of the impacts to them. And it's all couched in this question about, will the project have a significant impact to any of these matters? When one goes about preparing a referral, usually the first step is acquiring as much information as you can about the site and its surrounds. There's a whole lot of data sources that you can get from your computer. In Queensland, the government has a database of wildlife, flora and fauna sightings. It's called WildNet, or Wildlife Online. Atlas of Living Australia, species records. The Queensland Herbarium, records of flora specimens collected from across the state. eBird, Citizen Science Database. Similarly, BirdLife Australia's Bird Atlas. And then all sorts of mapping products. So Queensland's got very nice vegetation mapping or ecosystem mapping, regional ecosystems. So now you're starting to paint a picture of what your site and the landscape in which it sits is characterised by from a biodiversity perspective. Which species have been recorded in or near? What are the flora communities? How fragmented is it? So there's all sorts of data. You're painting a picture of your site. You know what your project is. You've got a footprint of the impact. The government has a brilliant database that has volumes of information about threatened species and ecological communities, SPRAC, Species Profile and Threats Database. In that, you can enter your species name, for example. Generally, there'll be, at the very least, something like a conservation advice document, which gives you some idea of the species, its distribution, its threats, its ecology. For a subset of species, they'll have a recovery plan, and that's obviously a more detailed description of the animal or plant, as well as some information about how it should be conserved. And then for a really tiny minority of species, noting that there's something like 1,900, is that right, Steve? 1,900 threatened species on the list? 1,800. So a small subset have very specific guidance on how to assess impacts. Black-throated finch, migratory shorebirds, reptiles, the brigalow belt, water mouse, northern quoll, koala. And then there is field work as well. So you've got all this desktop information, and then field work at this first stage, the referral stage, may be considered. And depending on the type of project and how big it is, field work may or may not be conducted at this stage. And I would suggest it's probably more likely to be undertaken in an instance where the proponent is seeking to submit the referral as what's called not a controlled action. In other words, we don't think it's a significant impact, and we have collected all this desktop information and we've gone out into the field to, I guess, substantiate this claim that the matters are either not there or they don't meet the criteria for significance. So that's probably when fieldwork is more likely to be undertaken. And that may be as simple as a day visit to do habitat assessments and vegetation validation, or you may do something a bit more thorough, like a full fauna inventory with trapping cameras or whatever it might be. So that's the referral stage basically. It all comes back to this question: significant impact on any matters of national environmental significance. You can answer that question for these very small number of species using these guidelines, but by and large you'll be defaulting to this document. So you've got all your information, you've got this guidance, and you make a determination, significant impact or not. The government then receives that document and will decide, no, the project is not a significant impact, or won't have any significant impacts, not a controlled action, is what that decision is called. And that means the project can proceed without Commonwealth oversight, so long as the project is undertaken in the manner specified in the referral document.
Jeremy, do you know if the government's required to justify that decision?
I don't know the answer to that question, no. But I'll show you what a decision letter looks like in a second, and it's pretty bereft of information. But I suppose, as Martine alluded to in the morning tea, there is an opportunity for people, us, anybody, to have input into even at the referral stage. So these are all put out for public comment, every single one. Yeah. Yeah.
I would also note that the time frames in some of those comments though are very short.
Yeah.
They'll put them out and they'll have 7 days to comment, which is pretty short time frame if you're talking about a pretty big project.
Yeah. 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 The other decision, well, there's several, but just for the purposes of what we're talking about now, not a controlled action, or the government might decide, given what you've told us in this referral, we believe there is a chance for significant impacts to matters of national environmental significance. Controlled action, and then we move on to the next stage of the approvals process. We'll get to that in a second, but just to have a look at a couple of these referrals, what they actually look like. This is Mount Cootha, lovely view. And this is what was proposed to happen up there until a few weeks ago. So the zipline projects, anybody who drives around Barden or Ashgrove or the Gap would have seen a lot of protest signs around this. The project's now been scrapped. But just to give you a bit of a flavour, and don't worry about all the text here, just picking out the red, for koalas, approximately 2 hectares of loss or disturbance to good quality koala habitat. And in the referral, the proponent indicated that they didn't consider this to be a significant impact, 2 hectares of loss. greater glider. So there's some avoidance that they've mentioned here. They've tried to avoid confirmed habitat, 2 hectares of loss or disturbance, loss of up to 85 hollow-bearing trees for a hollow-dependent species. Impact is not significant. We'll never know whether the government agreed with that because it never reached the decision because the project was pulled. This is a small-ish project out southwest of Brisbane, near the Ambley Air Force Base. You can see, I hope you can see on the map that that site in the pink is basically cleared paddocks, some scattered trees. There's a wetland on the right there, and there's a riparian corridor along that creek. This referral was submitted and the project was determined to be not a controlled action. That whole site was proposed to be developed for, I guess, infrastructure, industry. Interestingly, with this project, koalas are the major species out here, and they weren't listed at that point under the EPBC Act. If they were, I would have thought this would probably have been a significant impact requiring detailed assessment because of potential disruption to that corridor in a pretty fragmented landscape. Okay, and here's a big project that a lot of us will be familiar with, Toondah Harbour out at Cleveland, east of Brisbane. Big project footprint, heaps of matters of national environmental significance, threatened species, migratory species. It's in a Ramsar wetland. And so the decision on the referral here is that it's what's called a controlled action. It requires detailed assessment and approval. And the controlling provisions, in other words, the matters that the government is especially concerned about are those things: Ramsar wetlands, threatened species, migratory. This project is obviously still it's an ongoing thing. Okay, so we've got our controlled action. The government says we need more information to make a decision here. There are several different pathways in which the assessment can take. And I think the long and short of it is basically the more risk that the project poses and the more matters that could be affected, the higher, more detailed level of scrutiny is required, more detailed level of assessment. And the environmental impact statement is, I guess, the most comprehensive. Last flowchart in the presentation. Yeah, sorry, it's kind of a little bit dry, this stuff, but yeah, it's law, I guess. This is now, we're in the detailed assessment phase. Let's say we're doing an EIS for a big project. You need to demonstrate how you're going to avoid and mitigate impacts to those matters that are of particular concern. If there are impacts that are simply, they can't avoid them and they can't effectively manage them on site, that's residual impacts, unavoidable impacts, and that's where, please jump in if I'm getting this wrong, that's where offsetting starts to come into play. So the first question is, can the impact be offset, and is offsetting appropriate and feasible? I suppose oftentimes the answer to that would be yes. So then you identify as part of your strategy for managing the project's impacts that offsetting will be a component of that. And then having regard to the impact on the environment, as well as in economic and social considerations, that a decision is made on the project as to whether it can proceed or not. So approved with conditions, or not approved. I think it came into force in the year 2000. So this initial screening, the referral phase, 5,669 projects have had a decision made at the referral stage. Almost 70% not controlled action, 31% controlled action, and 10 just dead set, no deal straight up. So they would have been nuclear bombs in the reef sort of situation maybe. But so about 1 in 3 require that next stage of detailed, more rigorous, comprehensive assessment and final approval from the Commonwealth. So of those 1,700 or so projects, 994 have gone through the process to the point where a decision has been made. 983 approved and 11 not approved. So this is from statistics from the government from 2018. So I guess in effect 21 out of 5,600 have been deemed to have unacceptable significant impacts on MMES. So it's it's low, it's pretty low. Yeah, so this is an example of a project where a project that went through detailed assessment and was refused, not approved. So just take a moment to read these words. They give you a flavour for that decision-making process. This was a dam, proposed dam, about 2 hours, 3 hours north of here, on the Mary River, Traveston Crossing Dam. Very, very controversial project, and it was refused by the Environment Minister at the time, Peter Garrett, for this reason: unacceptably high impacts on 3 threatened species, and the risk was just too great in terms of how they were going to be managed. So now to, I guess, spend a couple of minutes digging into some of the research that's happening here and some of the ways that maybe we can contribute to this process and contribute improvements or suggestions on how it can be improved. I want to particularly focus on this issue or this topic of significant impacts. So the first one, and I'm really stoked, and I didn't know she was going to be here. So Roman, and please tell me if I get your surname wrong, Cristescu, is from the University of the Sunshine Coast. This excellent paper came out about 2 weeks ago on animal conservation. It's about how we assess impacts to threatened species, in this case it's the koala. And the really striking result from this that I took away was that comparing different survey methodologies, one being the government's guidelines for how to survey koalas versus a novel method, using the government guidance, the impact of the project was underestimated by a factor of 50. So if impacts for projects are being vastly underestimated for whatever reason, then the chance that they will be considered to be significant is obviously diminished. And if it's not significant, like the whole thing lives or dies by whether it's significant or not. So there's a lot of work to be done, and this wonderful piece of work is an example of it. In the space of how we assess impacts to these species and communities. Obviously April's done a mountain of really important work and advocacy around this topic, and I don't really want to speak on her behalf as she's not here. Suffice to say that this paper that came out, was that this year, Martine, 2019 or last year? Very recent. One of the major messages is around this idea of cumulative impacts and the fact that in isolation, a small project here, a small loss here of habitat, small losses, chipping away, death by 1,000 cuts. So an impact in isolation may not be significant, but when they add up, obviously there is an adverse effect. I've got a real, obsession with this concept of important populations. It's very niche, and I feel like the devil is in the detail in a lot of this policy guidance underneath the EPBC Act. This document we saw earlier is kind of like, as I said, really fundamental to this whole process. It tells you how to assess the significance of impacts to different matters. For critically endangered species, here's some criteria.
Can I just, because I hate these, because I just find that these make it even less clear what a significant impact is.
Yeah.
And I just wanted to point out, like, one of them is that it's likely to have significant impact on an endangered species if there's a chance it will reduce the area of occupancy of the species. Now, if you're going to remove some of its habitat, then of course that's going to happen. To me, I find this utterly unhelpful.
Yeah. And this is like, it's a very, very important document, and it's very widely used. This, and I know the text is small, but just to note that for these guys, endangered and critically endangered, impacts to a population of a species are considered significant. So population basically is the animal or plant there or nearby, and if it is, the impact likely to be significant. For vulnerable species, of which there are around 800 in Australia, it needs to be demonstrated that not only is the animal or plant there, but it's part of an important population of that species. And the guidance around what constitutes an important population is extremely vague and grey. And so for species like the greater glider, which occurs along the whole east coast of Australia, if your project in your survey work you find one greater glider, is that an important population? Or does there need to be 4 or 16? What is an important population, especially for these wide-ranging species? So that to me is a bit of a problem. Moving away from significant impacts, this has been touched on by some of the comments already. There's another issue here, problem I suppose, and that's the fact that a lot of, I'm trying to say this in a fairly neutral way, but a lot of change in the environment happens outside the scrutiny of the EPBC Act. In other words, a lot of stuff's happening on the ground that's not being referred. This report was commissioned by the government around the interactions between agriculture and the EPBC Act, and in the executive summary it's identified that of 6,000 referrals, 2.7% refer agricultural projects. And we know that a lot of, especially in our state, a lot of change is happening in that particular sector. There's a lot of nuance and caveats around this. It's not black and white, but there's a lot of stuff happening outside of the Act. And that's where Michelle's great PhD work, it's such a shame she's not here to expand upon this, but her work has found that, 93% of lost woody vegetation has happened outside of the footprint of an EPBC referral. So it's a lot of loss happening that's not going through this assessment, this formal assessment process. Again, there's a lot of nuance to that statistic, but just as a headline number, it's kind of pretty high. So to kind of round it out, there's a lot of good stuff. Like, it's kind of been a bit negative, but there's a lot of good stuff. This is familiar and well established, this Act and the policy underneath it and the process of EPBC referral. It's been around for almost 20 years. So we don't have this issue of, I think you've talked about policy ping pong in Queensland and the Vegetation Management Act. So there's some degree of consistency, which is great for industry. There's heaps of guidance. There's lots, the website for the Commonwealth Environment Department is chockers full of documents and guidelines about this Act and matters of national environmental significance. So there's a lot of information, but I guess there's always more that we want and need. And I guess a lot of you would have seen this report in The Guardian recently around the fact that only a small proportion of threatened species have recovery plans. What can we do? There's lots of things we can do. We can interrogate these key documents, around things like these criteria of significance. To me, that's a really important thing. I feel strongly about that. Is this your dog? So the way that Roman was able to determine this huge discrepancy in impact quantification was through a koala detection dog. And it's such a more efficient and more accurate way of determining impacts for that particular species. And there's heaps of cool stuff, like new ways of doing field work. They're not that new necessarily. Remote cameras, bioacoustics, drones, eDNA for aquatic species. So there's all this cool stuff that's happening that we can harness. And this is a great example of it. Mapping critical habitat critical to the survival is a trigger for significance for threatened species. For the black-throated finch, for example, we are provided with these coarse, indicative maps of where the bird and its habitat might be, but it still allows for that, I guess, interpretation or a bit of wiggle room about, is the habitat where I'm standing important or critical or not? So if we can contribute to more comprehensive, more detailed maps for some of these species, I think that would be a worthwhile undertaking.
Is it worth commenting on the difference between critical habitat and habitat critical?
Yeah. I can fumble my way through it, or you can do it.
I don't.
Well, so there's a register for critical habitat under the EPBC Act. It doesn't sterilise that habitat. I believe it can still be developed. Critical habitat register. There's 5 species listed out of 1,900 threatened species, or 5 sites. I think 5 sites that are critical habitat for 1,900 threatened species. Habitat critical to the survival is a requirement of recovery plans for threatened species under the Act. So if a species has a recovery plan, and I think it's a legislative requirement that habitat critical to the survival of the species be identified. A lot of recovery plans have as one of their first actions identify habitat critical to the survival of the species. So it's kind of, it probably should already be in there, but it's considered an action. Long and short of it is that there's not many maps. There's very few maps that I'm aware of that actually you can sort of definitively say this is habitat critical to the survival of this animal or plant.
But it's such a way of twisting language to make sure that there's a distinction between something that actually has much clearer specific protection, like critical habitat, which we just refuse to do in Australia. And instead, well, we clearly need to talk about the same concept, but we don't want to trigger that legality. So we're going to call it habitat critical to the survival instead.
Yeah.
But it doesn't have that level of protection that if it was actually called critical habitat, it would. I mean,
yeah, it's a trigger basically in the significant impact guidelines.
Yeah, with that, the first one, critical habitat. Do you know the 5 species?
I don't.
Yeah, because I heard Sarah Legg said that the something about that identification is it's only on Commonwealth land.
Yeah, I think that's another.
Which
so,
is like quite a small amount.
Yeah. And so I think one of them might be Macquarie Island, for example. Yeah. To have input into this whole big framework, there's opportunities to nominate species and communities under the EPBC Act as listed, and key threatening processes. So Martin, you've been involved in the process for the noisy miner as a KTP.
yeah, that's achieved a lot, hasn't it?
There are opportunities. We can participate in that process, and we do. Another thing that's not mentioned up here, and Nikki mentioned it, and it was mentioned in Monty, is the ability to comment on referrals and assessments, so we can participate in that way. But I guess most topically, the review, the Act is up for review. It's a statutory requirement that every 10 years the Act is reviewed. Happened in 2009. It's supposed to commence in no later than October, so it's really imminent. So I guess I would advocate to get involved in that review process. If there's anything that you are aware of or that you'd like to see changed or provide recommendations, there's a immediate and important opportunity. And the ESA have a survey available online now until Friday, I believe. And I kind of take that to be like a bit of a getting ahead of the game and just starting to consolidate some of the key points that people want to see changed in the Act. So that's it. Thank you.